Hello and welcome to Rise Like Lions. I'm Dave.
I'm Kevin.
And it's election season again. And we're doing the first of our series today. And you have a bit of something for us, don't you, Kevin?
I certainly do. Well, folks, it is that time again. September 20th, the federal election has been called, Canadian federal election. So for any American viewers, please stick around. You're gonna get some interesting inside stuff on the Canadian electoral scene. But for anyone, hopefully this will be a useful series, because what we're going to do is we're going to break down the issues that we're facing right now from a left perspective. We are unabashedly a left podcast. You don't have a picture of Che Guevara, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, and Tommy Douglas hanging behind you without being a left podcast. So that's us, and we're going to try and do this. The first episode is really just going to be looking at an overview of the big issues from sort of a left perspective. And then what we're going to do in the upcoming issues is look at the political platform of each of the parties, that each of the main parties in Canada, and what they are offering. So to start out, of the first, well, actually, sorry, before we get into the issues, I want to address one kind of overarching issue that when you think of the political left and you think of elections, and this is something that I'm gonna want to get Dave's thoughts on too. There is a bit of a debate in left circles about elections. There are some people who say, and I believe it was Emma Goldman who said, if elections changed anything, they would make them illegal. And so there's this idea, and there's a lot of people who are maybe more informed by anarchism in terms of their political philosophy, and they'll say something that, elections, they mean nothing, right? Elections never change anything. So there are people who say you shouldn't vote, you shouldn't care, right? And there are also people on the left too who are very focused on elections, and they think that actually elections are the most important way to make political change. And they sort of, say that people out in the streets protesting or doing direct action are kind of wasting their time, right? So that's another aspect, another perspective. And so when I was younger, I know in university, and I was a lefty back then too. This debate was really big, and I had friends who were, going on social media and whatnot, even though it wasn't very big when I was in university, but they were using all the means at their disposal to encourage people not to vote, and to suggesting that you're some sort of rube or simpleton if you buy into the machine, right, and vote. And then there was also a lot of people completely dismissing the importance of protests. And so I just want to give my take on this, folks, which is that the answer to the question of, do you use electoral politics or do you use direct action? The answer is obviously you use both. You use both all the time. And I think that there's a lot of historical evidence for this. There are a lot of examples from the past where if you don't have direct action, if you don't have people organizing in the streets, in communities, in the workplaces, then progressive change never happens, because politicians don't really have to pay attention to you, right? So there's examples of the labor movement. The labor movement, they started when unions were illegal, but workers organized anyway in the workplaces. They used direct action. They used wildcat sit-down strikes in order to get basically labor organizing recognized as a force, as a social force. However, at a certain point, what labor unions did is they realized they also needed to run labor politicians, create labor parties. They needed to get power within the state, which is kind of what you do in an election, right? You run for office, you get people in parliament, you even form government if you're able to, which in Canada, and again, one of the pictures behind us is the great Tommy Douglas, and he was one of the early leaders of the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. He was the premier of Saskatchewan. They gained power, the first socialist government in North America to form power. And what did they bring us? Well, they brought us our healthcare system. It started in Saskatchewan, then moved on to the rest of the country. So folks, that is a classic example of direct action organizing, linking up with electoral politics. And so, Dave, I'm kind of curious about your take on this debate. Is this something that you've encountered in your sort of activist circles over the years?
Yeah, it's a major one. In fact, I've been there probably in every viewpoint of that at some point.
Have you been that guy? Have you been that guy vote shaming people?
Totally been that guy. Well, you get frustrated. In fact, that's like everybody. You just get frustrated. You just start to say, it can't happen within these systems because, especially since the two major parties are so intricately tied to major forces in society, like the corporations and things like that, banking, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, you say, oh, what the heck? What's the point? So
Yeah.
you go all anarchist, and then
Full anarchist.
yeah,
We don't
and-
recommend, don't try this at home, boys and
No,
girls.
do not
do it.
try it at home because you're right. Ultimately, things are about universalism. They are about all the different approaches. There are different people. Some speak, some do, some write. Also, some are active in a way where they're out there in the streets, and
Yeah.
some are, and everybody can be supportive of each other's stance and viewpoint.
Yeah, I like how you said that, Dave. There's different people bring different skills to the struggle, right? The struggle for a more just society, a more compassionate society, an ecologically sustainable society. These are all things we're down with here, and we think the majority of people are. So there's many ways to achieve that, and so I think at the end of the day, and I want also, if it sounded like I was being hard on anarchists, I have anarchist friends. They are lovely people. They tend to be super committed, very passionate. I don't question that at all. They tend to be very involved in direct action struggle for really good causes, and so props to those folks. But having said that, if you're one of those anarchists out there vote shaming people, then stop it, because history. Don't do it because history does show, folks, we need both. And I mean, whether it's women's rights, whether it's healthcare, whether it's labor rights, whether it's LGBTQ rights, the link between direct action and electoral politics is a really powerful one. It's if you can work that dynamic, you get results, right? And we've seen that historically. And so just wanted to sort of start out with that, right? Like this idea, some people are like, elections, screw elections. Because like you said, the two major parties, especially in Canada, they're parties of the elite, right? We're talking about the conservatives and the liberals, right?
Yeah.
They really are.
And it's something you can understand. It's the idea of the average person who might be liberal or conservative, that you need that kind of power, that kind of influence, and ultimately that's what's going to get things done, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it might have all of us trapped.
Yeah.
And we want to free that up.
For sure.
And we need a full toolkit if we're going to fix something,
We do. And I
Forever.
think that's important too, is exactly. So us talking about the upcoming federal election is in no way to endorse the validity or the perfection of our current electoral system. I mean, that would just, you'd have to be smoking some serious crack to actually believe in that. And we're not, at least not today. So we don't want to suggest that there's nothing wrong with the electoral system. In fact, one of the things I'm going to talk about is about what's wrong with our electoral system. But without further ado, with that little sort of debate aside, I'm going to go through 10 important issues that are at play in this election today. And, you can find out yourself if these things resonate with you. If they don't, let us know. If they do, again, let us know. We're hoping to contribute to the conversation around what we should be concerned about in the upcoming election. So to start out, the first thing that is really top of everyone's mind right now is the environment. And with the environment, I want to be real that there's a lot of public concern for climate change, right? So people these days, when they think of the environment, they just think of climate change. So let's start out by giving climate change its due. It is definitely real and definitely important. I mean, all the recent reports coming out, whether it's from the International or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or from the NOA, there are reports coming out basically saying 2020 was the hottest year on record. The parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere has never been higher, and we're seeing extreme weather events all over the world. I mean, in Canada, BC was a nightmare this past summer of forest fires, of drought. Also, we're seeing this in California. We're seeing this around the world. So climate change is a huge issue. And climate change brings us to this idea of, can we transition to a post-carbon economy? Folks, it's renewable energy. We've got to do this at some point. So that's a huge issue. Also, renewable energy isn't the only thing we need to look at. We also need to look at energy efficiency in our production processes, in our transportation, in our construction processes. So we've got to get better at using energy. We've got to become energy efficient, and we've got to produce that energy through renewable means. So those are aspects of climate change, aspects of the environment that are really important. However, we've got to be clear that the environment does not begin and end with climate change. And in fact, there are so many other ways in which industrial capitalist civilization, the one that we exist in here in Canada, is destroying the environment. And so, we're existing within a mass extinction event. A lot of people are calling it the sixth mass extinction event. And this is really what the Anthropocene, the time of the geological time period we're living in, is all about, is a drastic reduction in biodiversity. So we're wiping out species. We're destroying ecosystems at record levels. What does this look like in Canada? Well, it looks like overfishing. It looks like deforestation. It looks like cutting down old growth forests. All of these things which are really, really destructive of ecosystems. It also in Canada looks like the tar sands. Probably the worst idea ever in the history of ideas is what we're doing in Alberta, northern Alberta, where we are, digging up massive amounts of boreal forest to extract oil from tarry sand. It is a horrible, horrible project from an environmental perspective. It's expensive because the amount of money and energy you need to place into the process of extracting tar sands oil is so incredibly high. So that's something we've got to deal with as a country. Can we have the tar sands and actually have net zero, or a transition to a post-carbon economy? The Trudeau Liberals would like to suggest we can, because they just bought a flippin' pipeline, right, with taxpayer money to the tune of, I think, about $4.5 billion. So this is something we've got to think about, right, in terms of what we are going to be able to do about the environment. And the last thing I want to say is we also really need to think about this question of industrial capitalism in general, consumer economies, constant growth economies. Can we even keep doing this? A lot of these things are linked, folks. And if you look at any complex system, a country like Canada is a complex social system, you're going to see a lot of linkages between different issues. And this is certainly the case when it comes to our next issue, which is the economy itself. And so, I'll just start out with what is the link between the economy and the environment? Well, it's pretty obvious. It's this idea that we have to, if we're going to transition into a post-carbon economy, if we're going to transition into a sustainable economy, we need to transition jobs. We need to basically facilitate people moving from ecologically destructive industries into industries that are ecologically beneficial, i.e., let's get the people at Fort Mac working the drilling rigs, let's get them building turbines, for instance, or let's get them building solar installations. Let's get them doing eco retrofits to existing properties and buildings and whatnot. We know we need to do this. And yet again, the idea of a just transition, which is often talked about, is something that, people are not really I don't hear a lot about that talked about in terms of political parties and what they're actually trying to achieve and accomplish. So, yeah, other things about the economy as well, as we've seen COVID wreak incredible amounts of economic destruction. Small businesses have really, really paid a price. And so one of the things, and people might be surprised if, why does a lefty care about business? Well, small business is important. If you think about the kind of economy we'd like to have, sure, it would have, maybe more government-run enterprises. It would have co-ops and nonprofits for sure. But also there's going to be a lot of small business people. So small business people, I'm going to argue, they should be anyway, our allies as leftists. Now, that's not to say that everyone running a small business is some sort of great person. Sometimes they're total dicks. But in general, small business, important. How do we support them? How do we ensure that they come out of the pandemic and they're viable? But also related to the economy too is the idea that we need better paying unionized jobs. So we need, more protection for labor unions. We need more, we need it sort of easier for people to organize unions. We also need better labor protections. So, paid sick days is a big thing we need to do to sort of keep the economy going and growing. So, Dave, I think one of the interesting things, just to finish off, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is the economy. If you read the Globe and Mail or the National Post or whatnot, it often seems like it's this thing that is this overarching force that we don't really have any control over, that controls our lives. But is that really the case? Is it really the case that we can't decide what kind of economy we want to have?
No, I mean, we have to consider factors like, the international world of trade and all that kind of thing. But ultimately, no, what's the point? It needs to be our economy, right?
Yeah.
And yes, it is important that banking be considered the interest of large and small business and all that kind of thing. But if ultimately it's not in service of the people ourselves, there just is no point to it.
Yeah.
It's already a failure if it's treated as something that's completely out of our control. What I think many of us feel is too much is out of our control, and we'd like to work together in each other's interests, but ultimately have a little bit more say in what happens in the economy. There are no magic hands. We are making decisions, and when they aren't working for us, they should be altered.
Yeah.
And it should always be checked on up against what decisions you're making politically or even in your lives, and what results you're getting, and then you make corrections.
For sure. And if there is an invisible hand, Dave, and you're a working person, the invisible hand is flipping you off. That's pretty much what's happening.
Yeah, it's the enemy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. Well, listen, let's segue into the third issue then, which again, you're going to see it, not surprisingly, links. It is inequality. And so one of the things that we see in Canada today is really an unprecedented level of inequality. And this has been growing over the past couple of decades. A few things have been happening. Income inequality has been growing. So that is obviously how much money various groups of people are paid throughout the year, but also wealth inequality as well. So wealth looks at all the assets you own. And it doesn't matter what measure you look at, the gap between the rich and the poor has been growing in Canada. We know this has been happening in the United States. We know it's been happening actually really all over the world. So the 1% has been running away with the vast amount of income and wealth. So this is a big issue in Canada, right? It's not just poverty, but it's also the fact that many working people are one or two paychecks away from financial oblivion. For some reason they lost those paychecks if they became ill and they didn't have good benefits to back them up if they lose their job. So that's a high level of precarity in our economy. And so that's a big issue. Another issue too is this idea that, the supports we have for our most vulnerable. And so people who are on disability or people who are just, not easily fully employable, and just people who've fallen on hard times because, they've lost a job or whatever else. We don't have sufficient supports for them. And so this is where things like a universal basic income is being talked about, not just in Canada, but all over the world. And this is the kind of thing we need to be looking at when we move forward in Canada. And, we have examples. We have two examples that leap to mind. One was in the 1970s in Dauphin, Manitoba, where the Mincome study was done, and it was a study on a guaranteed income. Unfortunately, the study was not completed. The results were not written up. There was no formal report done, which is probably for ideological reasons, because the next government that came into power didn't want it reported on. But some people who've gone back and done some analysis have shown that actually when the Mincome experiment was happening, that the people that were receiving this income top-up, they had lower rates of hospitalization, there was higher rates of school completion, there was less reports of mental health difficulties. So there was all these sort of side benefits. And unfortunately, we don't have the right data on it. More recently in Ontario, the Wynne government, and they were a Liberal government, but you got to give Kathleen Wynne props because she brought in the Ontario Basic Income pilot program. And it seemed like a success. The people that were on it, they were really reporting getting a lot of benefit from it. People were able to go back to school who weren't able to afford it before. People were able to, afford a place to live, or maybe before they struggled with it. So this is something else that we need to really think about in terms of inequality. But there's other forms of inequality too. And so one of the things that Canada, I know, before I jump from the more economic side of inequality, minimum wages are one of the other ways in which societies have traditionally helped inequality. And in Canada in particular, there's one way to calculate whether a wage is actually sufficient, and they call it the rental wage. And what the rental wage means is you look at average housing prices in a community, and then you look at what someone would need to be making, how many dollars per hour, in order to actually afford an apartment in the town in which they live. And folks, the rental wage is way higher than the current minimum wage. So right now, I think the highest minimum wage in Canada, if I'm not mistaken, is $15 an hour. That's in Alberta. Ontario is at 14. We were supposed to go up to 15, but of course, good old Doug Ford kiboshed that. So you look at $15 an hour as the highest minimum wages in Canada. The rental wage is between $20 and $23 an hour. So that means if someone is going to be able to afford an apartment, they need to be paid basically, $6 to $8 more an hour than they're getting right now if you're a minimum wage worker. So minimum wage is another huge issue in Canada. But also in terms of other forms of inequality, I mean, you have still a high degree of gender inequality and issues around women's rights within Canada. One of the big issues is around reproductive rights, which are definitely under attack both within Canada and the United States. So there have been, far right and conservative fundamentalist groups that are suggesting that, we need to basically put controls on abortion, take away a woman's right to control her own body. That's a huge issue. There are also issues too around ongoing concerns for sexual violence, right? The need to support shelters, to support women's organizations. I remember when the Stephen Harper government was in power, they defunded a number of women's organizations. And I don't think those organizations have ever fully recovered, although, the Liberals have put a little bit more money into them as well. But yeah, rising inequality is a serious issue. So, is a political party going to address it? Is a new government going to address it? I hope people would bring that into their discussions about the election and what they're going to focus on. And so, Dave, I know, we live in Hamilton, right? Hamilton, Ontario, and
Right.
and we're a city that has experienced over the years a lot of inequality, a lot of homelessness. Just in the years you've been in Hamilton, how have you seen that situation change and evolve?
Yeah, well, I remember back, was it my teen years, just after that, when Mike Harris came in
Oh,
here,
Harris.
for example.
Yeah.
And one thing he did was sizably change how we dealt with those with mental health issues,
Yes.
right? So it started to get offloaded and become something that other aspects of healthcare and the penitentiary system, like with policing and things like that, instead of having housing that was safe for them and more readily available, it got entirely left in their hands.
Yeah.
That kind of thing really puts a burden on the entire society. So I saw a sizable shift. The amount of homelessness, because as the value of money keeps drifting away from what minimum wages are, right? The amount of jobs were already changing just because of factors like the employers moving out of country, things like that.
Definitely.
right?
Yeah, lots of that happen in Hamilton.
You put all these things together, and basically I'm saying that things became far less stable. They deteriorated more easily. There's a lot more pressure on renters as much as rentees
Yeah.
because of all these factors, right?
Yeah, Harris. I'm glad you mentioned Harris, because that's just another
Are
example.
you? I'm never glad to mention or think about
Yeah,
Mike Harris.
I should clarify that the guy's a total douchebag. But I'm glad you mentioned just that whole, because it was devastating to Ontario, the province that we're in. And it just shows the importance of, if you don't think elections matter, folks, like, you can get a wrecking ball like Mike Harris elected if he gets enough I don't know, simple-minded people to vote for him. And this is where I have a good friend, Frank, who always talks about how conservatives have different brains. They have enlarged amygdalas, apparently. I'm not sure this is true or not. I'm not sure it's fair to say that all conservatives are brain damaged. Maybe they are. I don't know. But they sure sometimes act like it because, to elect someone like Mike Harrison, he literally waged war on the poor. He really did, and he sort of bragged about it. It was part of this common sense revolution, right? So horribly monstrous. We want to do a 180 from the Mike Harris agenda, right? So I'm glad you brought that up, Dave. Okay, moving on though. What is the next issue? Well, not surprisingly, linkage is a bit of a theme here. So the next issue links up pretty strongly with the ones we've talked about before. But what's interesting now is that affordable housing is actually getting a lot of play in the mainstream media. And so what's been happening is you have an undeniable housing crisis now across the country, a crisis of affordability. And in certain communities, it is very intense. So actually, Hamilton is one of the most intense in Canada in terms of this price crisis, housing crisis. Toronto, obviously, is another community, Vancouver, Ottawa. So there's so many urban centers in which it's become almost impossible for a working person to afford to rent or especially to buy a home. And so this is something that it's good to see the media talking about it. We need a heck of a lot more done, though. So, what are some various things that contribute to the housing crisis? Well, one is a lack of supply. So there simply have not been as many homes created as have been, as our population has grown. Our population growth has far outstripped the amount of new homes. But specifically, there's not enough affordable homes being created. So, the government retreated from an affordable housing strategy, the federal government, decades ago. It used to be the case. I have personal experience in this because I'm, the executive director of a nonprofit that wanted to build affordable housing originally. And just before we started our co-op to get involved in affordable housing, the federal government used to pay 100% of the capital cost of new affordable housing developments. So this was in the late 90s. And, sucks to be us. Our timing was not great. And so in the early 2000s, when we were starting up our co-op, the government just totally abandoned its affordable housing mandate. So this is something the Liberals have put a little bit of money into, but there needs to be a lot more done in terms of that affordability. Another aspect, too, of this is the importance of investment. So investment income and property speculators getting involved in the marketplace. This is a big problem. So you have some housing markets in Canada that are truly international investment markets, Toronto and Vancouver being obvious examples. So what this means is you have people from all over the world investing in real estate in Canada because it's seen as a smart investment. And yet what that's doing is jacking prices up, and it's taking housing away from people that could otherwise need it and use it. And related to this too is the phenomena of short-term rentals. So the Airbnb effect, which again, in large communities, Toronto and Vancouver in particular, but it's growing. There's a number of possible dwelling units that are being taken off the market because they're turned into sort of Airbnb units as opposed to, family rentals and whatnot. So a lot of different aspects about the housing crisis. And again, Dave, in terms of locally, like in Hamilton alone, it has been unbelievable what's been happening to rents and property values in the city.
That's right. Yeah, just the effect alone of the prices in Toronto becoming so preposterous that people are moving towards Hamilton and Niagara. Mm-hmm. That effect alone driving it up for everyone else. And then you mentioned the foreign investors, right? Well, one of the key things about them that changed since back in the 70s and before was they started very much treat it just like buying gold or something, the same way. They buy it and it sits there.
Yes.
And we've been trying to put pressure on them that you can't allow that, or there has to be a substantial extra tax for leaving things dormant in that way.
Definitely.
Because we do need the housing. So
Yeah.
we keep building and expanding, including Doug Ford wanting to put it into some of our most sensitive areas, with good wild land or with good viable agricultural land, and turning it into things where there's, housing condos and new suburban complexes,
Yeah.
which wouldn't be necessary if there weren't Chinese, Russian, and other investors coming, buying extremely expensive condos and apartments and that kind of thing, and just leaving them empty because they just want to take advantage of the valuation.
Definitely. And I think that, it's such a good point that you made too about the effect it has. So this is happening, say, maybe in certain urban centers, but it ripples out, right?
It
so,
does.
and in Hamilton, we're an example here. And I want to be careful. It's not to blame people from Toronto and say,
No,
you damn Torontonians, you're getting priced out of your own market, that you're getting screwed. But then, of course, you're moving into other communities too, looking for housing. That's driving up the prices everywhere. So yeah, it is a problem that really, again, that theme of interconnectivity, right? These things ripple out throughout the whole social system. So anyway, yeah, housing is a big issue. Again, it's getting some play in the media. Let's hope that continues. So moving on. Next big issue we need to think about, and this one is kind of an agglomeration because, we want to try and keep things, I'm trying to keep the list to 10. So, but healthcare, education, and public services. So there are several issues at play here. I mean, the big one in terms of healthcare is simply the accessibility, first of all, of healthcare. So one of the things that is, it's amazing that Canada has a public healthcare system. Again, why was it won? Through socialists, right? It really was, historically speaking. Do your research if you disagree with me on that. So we have earlier generations of socialist organizers, labor organizers, all sorts of wonderful people created a public healthcare system. And Canadians really like our public healthcare system. But is it funded effectively, sufficiently? No, it isn't. Are there enough nurses and doctors? No, there aren't. Are hospital wait times too long? Yes, they are. But that's not because our system is broken or doesn't work. It's because it's not funded effectively. So one of the issues continually in Canada is, are you going to fund the healthcare system effectively? Another issue is, are you actually going to cover all of the healthcare needs that people have? And so we know, for instance, two huge holes in the system right now are a lack of pharmacare for most people and dental care. So again, huge issues that need to be addressed in terms of our healthcare system moving forward. And the last thing I'll mention too is there's a lot of creeping privatization that mostly conservative governments, but some liberal governments too, have been guilty of. And so this is where they try to slowly chip away at the public system and make it more and more private. We see this in Ontario. I mean, it's like all the labs are private now. I mean, most of the places where you go to get diagnostic tests are private. There's more and more privatization creeping into the system, and that's really, really worrisome. With education, there's related issues around funding. So, will the federal government actually increase its funding for post-secondary education? That's a big issue. Will the federal government, try and do anything about student loan debt as well? That's another really important issue. And finally, around education is, will the government do anything about tuition? And there are many countries around the world that have free post-secondary education. It's something that seems like a pipe dream to many people in Canada. And yet there are many countries, many European countries that have free post-secondary education. So that's something that as well is sort of on the table. Finally, for public services, the issue again is, are we going to continue to try to privatize public services, or are we going to try to keep them public, whether this is home care or child care? These sorts of services, I think from a left perspective, are better run by nonprofit, either private nonprofit or state-run agencies. So are we going to be able to, expand the public social service system? And also, are we going to be able to meet the mental health needs of our citizens? Because during COVID, we saw an incredible increase in two challenges. So mental health and substance abuse. And again, Dave, this is something that we have also experienced here, right?
Yeah, we certainly have. One thing was coming to mind when you're talking about all that. It's kind of back to economics. We changed at one time, thinking of COVID. Now, how much sooner might we have had a very effective vaccine? Mm-hmm. If we still had what we used to have, along with Healthcare Canada, were our own research labs leading the world in vaccines.
Yes.
And so you get excellent vaccines, and when it needed to be, it would be responsive to the needs of the community, the special needs, especially when suddenly something like a coronavirus comes along, right?
Such a good point.
And what affected that not being there now? The healthcare issues you spoke up, even the housing, what's affecting all of these things is a concept of economics that isn't complete. Economics was never a business discipline. It was a social discipline and considered an entire picture, right? So is it really very efficient and effective to not have the vaccine production done publicly? Is it really so great to have this much of the whittling away at public health care and not fully expanding it to the original vision of those socialists? Oh my. No, what keeps causing that is people who believe in the Chicago school style of economics and this kind of thing. The problem is it's only a belief. It does not work. We have an entire society, when you don't consider that in your economic models, you make foolish decisions that seem good. And in the end, they do not work out for everybody.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, David. I'm glad you mentioned the vaccines, right? And the whole coronavirus response, the whole pandemic, right? And it is a classic example of how if you have a universalist framework, like you said, if you're looking at the society as a whole and you're looking at the economy as something that serves the society as a whole, then having domestic production of vaccines, breaking the patents, right, of the vaccines and allowing generic production, and even there should have been publicly funded, public source vaccine creation. There was attempts at that. We know, right? And Canada, of course, didn't sign on to those initiatives, And so, that's such a great example of the different vision, I guess. Like from a left perspective, it simply is. There's no secret to it. It's like looking at society as a whole and sort of saying, well, listen, we need to, but we need individual freedom. We need all these groovy things. It's not about forcing people to act a certain way or think a certain way or be a certain way, but we need to look after each other. It's pretty basic stuff, right? And so you need that capacity to look after your populace.
Do you have any freedom if you can't do anything with it? If you don't have enough money to do the things you want, is there any freedom? I think that's an absurdity of an idea.
Exactly.
And same with the vaccines. Could we have better put pressure on our own government if it was produced here to then say, okay, forget what everybody else's interests, the Americans and others. But do we really want something like the mutations like Delta variant that are here that are causing me to live in a personal way less free because I have to restrict myself again? And you can think, I just want my freedom, so I'm still not going to. I'm tired of this. I'm not going to wear the mask. I'm not going to vaccinate or whatever like that. But then you may lose the ultimate freedom, life itself.
Good point.
Or give the illness to a child or an older person in your life who you love. And then, hey, great freedom, but you don't get to share it with them anymore.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. So just in the interest of getting through the list here, folks, going to move forward. And this is a topic that often you're not going to hear talked about by the main political parties, generally speaking. You're often not going to hear much about it in the mainstream press. But some people might say, so say maybe you're watching this show and you don't identify as a lefty. And one of the classic things you'll probably retort is like, you just want to create all these new programs and you want to spend a bunch of money you don't have. And like, you crazy spendthrift lefty loonies, how are you going to get all the money? Well, folks, there's a story here that needs to be told. And that is that over the past literally 50 years, there has been a steady decrease in taxes paid by the very wealthy and corporations in Canada. So some historical information a lot of folks aren't aware of. In 1948, the highest marginal income tax rate in Canada. So what that means is that's the rate of tax you paid when your income was in the highest income bracket. Highest marginal tax rate, 80%. This is in 1948. So it's after the war is over, and Canada is entering into, North America really is entering into a period of the greatest economic growth it's ever experienced. And the highest tax rate, 80%. What is it today? It's about 46%. So that's a huge decrease in the marginal tax rate. that basically the very, very rich are simply not paying as much tax by a lot, right? Same thing with corporate taxes. So back in the day, the Canadian corporate tax rate, the federal corporate tax rate, was over 40% in 1960. Today, it's about 15%. So huge cuts have been made to the very wealthiest and corporations. Where do you get the money to pay for social programs, good universal social programs that every single person benefits from, every single Canadian? You get it by bringing up the tax rates, making them more progressive again for the very wealthy and for corporations, not for middle class people, not for working class people, not for poor people. So got to be really clear about that. Those people should not have any tax increases at all, even though I don't mind the taxes I pay. Right? But we're not the ones that should be bearing all the burden, right? When basically speaking, it's been, a very small group of people that have made out like bandits over the past couple of decades. The last thing I'll say about taxes too is there's a basic inequality in the tax code in Canada in which capital gains, so that means the appreciation of any asset that you own, could be a home, could be a share, could be a stock, that the increased value you realize from that is only taxed at 50% of what your income is taxed at. So what that means is that people who have stocks and bonds and property that is, appreciating over time, they are getting less tax than people who don't have that stuff, which is ridiculous, right? So it's further increasing the inequality between rich and poor. And so, tax policy, Dave, it may seem like one of those kind of geeky inside baseball things, right? But really it speaks to this fact of like, what do conservatives always say? Where are you going to find the money for that? There's no money for that. It's a bogus statement, right?
It certainly is. And it comes down to that view, that incomplete view of economics again, because it is just a fact. Those in our kind of class levels and below to the lowest, everything you get in your hand is put back out there in some practical way. There might be a bit in whatever kind of savings and a little bit of investment or whatever like that. But
no offshore bank accounts.
Yeah, well, at least I'm not saying. But, no.
None that I'm aware of anyway.
No, and I don't know. If anything, the fact that there are offshore bank accounts is evidence for the fact, in addition to that, most of the money in the upper scales is never spent. It's never recirculated. Yeah. But also the fact that they will do those offshore bank accounts and all that kind of thing is all the more reason on why it does have to be exceptionally high. Because at that exact same time, that highest echelon here in 48, it was 80%. In the US, that was 90%.
Yeah.
And it was often higher, like it was pretty much 100 in the UK, Yeah. And it made sense. One, most of what's going to those of us who, the mere peasant, the mere rabble below that level, goes back into circulation. Theirs does not. It sits aside. Or taken out of country, as you say.
Yeah.
Secondly, the tendency to not reinvest, even in their own companies,
yes,
increases with every dollar they save in taxes beyond a certain point. People are sold a bill of goods about this. They're confused about it. We have progressive taxation for a reason.
Yeah.
Even if we do all kinds of rules about what, multi-millionaires and billionaires are going to end up paying and what large corporations will pay, that doesn't affect you whatsoever. Got news for you, folks. It wouldn't matter what you do with the systems. The vast majority of us will never be millionaires, never mind billionaires. It's not a thing. So we have to have a complete picture of economics again to consider all of this.
What a buzzkill, Dave. So you mean I'm not going to get my own rocket? I'm not going to get to blast myself into space like Richard Branson and Elon Musk? And
well, if we make it a universal program, we just might.
Jeff Bezos and his flying space dildo. I'm not going to get to do that too?
Well, you might win the lottery. Pay that poor tax. You might win.
Yeah, I might. No, that's a great point. All right, so moving on, folks. The 7th big issue that we should be considering as leftists coming into this federal election is one that shouldn't surprise anyone. We have had recent experiences in Canada where the colonial history of our country, the genocidal history of our country, has come to the forefront again. And this is because of primarily the discoveries at residential schools, spread out across the country, where there are mass graves. And what's really chilling is there's only a handful of schools where there have been these discoveries. And yet there are well over 100 residential schools spread across the country. I think it's more like about 160. I don't have the exact number, so don't quote me on that. But there's a lot of residential schools. And even in a handful, we already have, hundreds and hundreds of bodies. And so this has brought this issue to the forefront. So, there are many, many aspects to this issue. One is obviously full discovery of what transpired at the residential schools. That means looking for graves. That means, bringing justice to those deceased victims of the residential schools for their families so they can be buried in their traditional ways. It means, coming face to face with this in terms of our political discourse, our popular discourse. This means looking at such things as who do we build monuments to? Who do we build statues to? Who do we not build statues to? I know these are controversial issues for some people, but we really have to come to terms with this history. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was, a federal government initiative, did come back stating unequivocally that our past colonial settlers committed cultural genocide. And I think other people could make the argument that it was genocide, period. You don't have to even put the cultural in front of it. So we need to come to terms with this. An aspect of this is land claims too, right? So will we get a government that actually starts dealing honestly and in good faith to resolve land claims, and to bring Native communities. And this is the interesting thing, to bring them fully in partnership with Canada, as for instance, in this area, the Two Row Wampum suggests, where there's supposed to be, two ships of state sailing side by side. We can't do that unless First Nations communities have the autonomy that they need to really determine their own education priorities, their priorities around economic development, their priorities around corrections, right? And sort of restorative justice. These are things around their preserving their language and their heritage, their culture. So these are really important things. And the last thing about this issue too is, to fully address, we talked about inequality earlier, but I left this piece out because it's sort of its own issue, is in Canada, there is a horrendous disparity in terms of homelessness, poverty, rates of incarceration, early mortality between the Native and the non-Native population. So these things need to be taken seriously. Native communities need the resources to address these issues. And so again, a huge, huge issue. And, Dave, this is something that gets a lot of lip service paid, from governments. And I know, Pretty Boy in there right now was a big talker when it came to this, making good on truth and reconciliation. And it just doesn't seem to happen.
Yeah, I saw the headdress. It was beautiful.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
He'll perform it, but will he actually do it?
I heard one quote that really made sense. Amazing, you can put through a massive pipeline, but you can't seem to get water to a few reservations.
That great point.
And that's that narrow view again.
Yeah.
That water right to them directly improves those lives.
Big time.
And improves the health, everything else, makes them more stable, gives them more strength to be able to do everything else they need to do.
It's fundamental.
Without it.
It's fundamental to life, really, right?
Without it, forget it. Now, it may be true, as he said, that having that what will be made from that pipeline will help to support the improvement of so many things, including the environment, because you know how gas improves, gas and oil. Nothing better to fix the environment.
Yeah.
Sorry.
More tar sands. That's what we need.
You started it by calling him Pretty Boy. Got me going on that. No, it's truly sad. All those bodies at each place. And it had been said all along that it was known they were there.
Yeah.
We knew that from just getting the reports about how many were found in Ireland. The indigenous people of that place are the Irish, as surely as these people are the indigenous of here.
Yeah.
And it came from an overall mentality that was a mistake. And, we don't have to harp on it. None of us were there to do that. We
Yep.
didn't do it. One awesome guy, he's native, had said, don't worry about celebrating Canada Day. Just understand that we need to mourn and we need to think about this. So go ahead and enjoy it. You didn't do this. And I hope, nor would we in these times. But
Yeah.
it still has to be considered. And it's
Yeah,
still,
Yeah, it's like I think that's an important point. Is there's an important principle in natural law, which is that the crimes of the father will not be visited on the children, right? And so it's true.
Should hope not.
We weren't personally there, and yet we are, as people whose ancestors were settlers in this land. We have a responsibility to deal with the issues as they exist today, and the issues as they exist today, as we've just sort of discussed and talked about, need to be front and center. So it'll be really interesting to see if they are dealt with meaningfully in the upcoming election. But moving on, let's see where else we need to address here. This is another big one. And so we saw this in the last, in 2020, so the year before, there was an explosion in protest around policing. And a lot of this was fueled by George Floyd, the tragic murder of George Floyd by police officers. And yet the protests spread beyond the United States and spread all over the world. And they spread to Canada too, because we have our own issues with law enforcement. And so, like with many of the things we've talked about already, there's multiple aspects to this. So one aspect of it is proper training for police officers, right? In terms of, de-escalation and cultural sensitivity and nonviolent intervention, all of these sorts of things. There's issues around oversight, public oversight of policing, strengthening the ability of citizens to determine how they want their police forces to act. There's issues around funding, right? Like looking at diverting funds away from police and towards other social service providers, like social workers, like paramedics, like nurses. There's changing models of policing whereby you don't have armed cops show up to deal with someone who's harmless and mentally ill, because a lot of these people end up getting shot and killed, right, by the police. So there's a lot of aspects. And the last one I would say that's a big one is the demilitarization of our police forces. So a disturbing trend over the last couple of decades have been that police forces have been getting more and more essentially war equipment. They've been getting armored personnel carriers, and they're all, in high-tech, high-powered weaponry. We don't need these things to police our communities. So there's a lot that needs to be done around policing, and again, it'll be interesting to see what actually does get picked up by the various political parties on this issue. It's a very hot button issue. It's very in the media still, but there still needs to be some real tangible change here.
Yeah, there does. A lot of the problems we've run into have been from this. There would be enough for the healthcare services we need in our communities, for instance, if it just hadn't been diverted to policing.
Yeah.
We need it. We need the policing to be solid, and they need a chance to do well at the things that are actual police issues.
Yep.
Right. And in order to do that, you can't be distracted by so many things that are not police issues.
Yeah.
A lot of aspects of the drug war, the mental health crises, right? Showing, if you show up at a place and you've been used to viewing it as crime and criminals, but now you're just dealing with someone that's having a bad day, that just had a conflict with medication, that it was simply a family, there's no problem, but a family member was just a bit concerned.
Yeah.
They haven't shown up to a few things last little while. It's been a while. Are they eating? Are they taking care of themselves? Do they need some assistance? And they can't get to them right then. They live in another city, or they're just simply working a lot, or they have a young, a baby, a new baby, whatever it is. And they're just like, can you take a look? How much better would it be someone who's trained for this kind of thing and so can distinguish it and doesn't have to leave a horrible crime scene or something to come to just do that simple social service?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Dave, like how you sort of broke down the scenario, right, in which a different model of intervention is required, because a lot of times in the public, I know there's been a lot of polarization around this idea of defunding the police, and it's maybe just partly the wording of it. You know, some people hear that and they're like, oh, you want to get rid of the police, you want to take away all their funding, sort of thing. And it's like, and I would agree with you, Dave, there are legitimate things that police do. There is a legitimate role, I think, and some leftists would disagree with me. They'd say, no, fuck all the cops. There's no good reason. There's no good cops, and there's no good reason for policing. I don't.
More complicated than that.
I think it's a little more complicated than that. But we can say, and this is where I don't have a problem with any individual police officer until they give me a reason to have a problem with them. And well, you know, there's a lot of problems with some officers, but there's also some good officers.
And then
too.
I just want to say, in that case, we should keep in mind, even if there is a problematic one, it may not all be, he should do better. Yeah, I mean, you took that job. But it may not all be their problem. You know, staffing issue also resolved if they don't have to do things that they shouldn't have to do.
That they're not trained to do. They're not equipped to do, right?
And how horrible it is to have some of the experiences that you have taking care of things that you shouldn't have to, and the kind of pressure and the kind of paperwork, kind of things like that. And then if that causes them to have an attitude. And once you've broadened your approach for beyond criminal activity and that kind of thing into other things, whether it's, you know, just simple traffic things all the way to healthcare, that makes it harder for it to be put into perspective. So dealing with you on just a regular day, that police person might be having the wrong time that day and having trouble now distinguishing between a crime issue or just regular.
It's like everything starts to look like a nail, right? When you're trained to be a hammer.
The police hammer.
And I think you know, to be fair too, I don't think either of us are suggesting that it's just a few bad apples. Like that's not the case.
One bad apple spoils the bunch, mind you, if you want to use that kind of metaphor.
But I mean, I think it's a systemic issue, right? And that's where, again, you can be certainly critical of individual officers, and they need to be, but it's the broader system that needs to change. And if that broader system changes, then I do think you'd get different behavior, you'd get different actual results from the interactions between police and the community. So definitely structural change needed in policing. You know, also the aspect of anti-oppression training, anti-racist training, cultural sensitivity, like all these sorts of things too. Really, really important aspects. But let's get going to our last two important issues. Now, this, again, Dave, is one that I don't think you're going to hear talked about a lot in the mainstream media. Mainstream media, prove me wrong. Prove me wrong.
Please.
Yes, because this is a big one, folks, and it's the simple fact that we're talking about the upcoming federal election, and it's going to be run in one of the dumbest ways possible. What I mean by that, it's going to be run using what's known as the first past the post system of voting, and it is the most antiquated and really ill-conceived form of running an election. And what this means is just that in every individual electoral district, you've got three candidates. Let's say the candidate with the most votes wins, and all of the other votes in that district are simply discarded. They're thrown away. It's like they didn't even happen. And so what that can mean is you can have someone who wins in a three-way race. Maybe they've got 40% of the vote. 60% of the people in that riding didn't even vote for them. It doesn't matter. 60% of the populace's political will was completely discarded. And that happens across the country in every single electoral district, and it leads to completely messed up election results. It tends to give us false majorities. So again, a political party will get a majority with 41%, 42% of the popular vote. And then they essentially have a 4-year dictatorship if they are a majority government. And so, folks, there is an antidote to this, the good news, and it's called proportional representation. There are many, many models around the world that are used by democracies. Old democracies, stable, established, well-respected democratic countries have proportional voting systems. And it's too complex to get into in a detailed way. Maybe we'll do something on Electoral Forum, Dave. That would be kind of fun, and do a deeper dive because it's worthwhile. But the basic idea, folks, is that in a proportional system, all the votes are counted, and all the votes count in the sense that, you know, if 30% of people across the country vote for this party, that party is going to get roughly 30% of the seats in the government. another party gets 20%, same thing, they're getting at 20% of the seats. Now, what proportional systems tend to do is they give you more minority governments, and they encourage real democracy, coalition building, debates, differences in how political problems are solved, as opposed to one government just being, screw you, we've got a 4-year mandate, we're going to do whatever we want. So again, electoral reform, we're not going to hear much about it, but man, oh man, do we need it. And Dave, I don't know, what do you think? Are we ever going to get PR in Canada?
I don't know. I'll tell you.
Loaded question.
Yeah, I'll tell you. Pretty boy, Justin Trudeau.
Yep.
He got a substantial amount of votes. I know. I even thought about it just on the electoral form thing itself, and amazing how that went away instantly after he actually got in power.
Yes.
Why? Because it's the other one that gets you a majority.
Yes.
And isn't that nice for you? Isn't that convenient? If all of the other proportionality and everything didn't come into play, and all we did was one thing in that meantime is bring in ranked choice, I would be a very happy guy.
Yeah.
And some things could begin happening.
Yeah.
A lot of us, and for good reason, like I was no fan of Mr. Harpo. I nearly played fair and called him Harpo.
Herr Harper.
Just the way we were calling Trudeau Pretty Boy, just to even things out. But I was no
He's just
fan
got
of
such great
him.
hair, though. He's just got such great hair.
It's just fantastic. Hair and skin. But no, he's really had a problem with him, and so there was a big movement in it. I was certainly part of it, which is like, whatever you got to do, man, just get this clown out.
Get Harper out. Yeah,
Get
that was
him
the
out of
sentiment.
there. Get Harper the clown out. Yeah, but the problem with it, though, is then you vote strategic, and strategic has not been very strategic and calculated in our lifetimes.
Definitely.
What does help to resolve it is ranked choice, where you simply say, okay, look, if I really had my preference, if I really, I like that Jagmeet Singh guy, and I would like to have more of a voice in things and have some decisions made, according to the public will, and that'd be great. But if it's not going to happen, I cannot have a Doug Ford type guy over the whole nation. Nope, just can't be. And then, you know what? I'll eat it and let it be Mr. Trudeau.
Yeah.
But there's a chance then that some ridings, some places, the will might turn out to be far more than you thought.
Yeah.
We're busy people. We can't let it be known, even with social media, that we're maybe thinking more progressively, that we're realizing we need true alternatives.
Yeah.
But this gives you a chance to express it. And I also think it would get a lot more of the young out there voting
definitely.
at that point, feeling there's some meaning to it, when they just know that a lot of the older generations will just dominate it, and that's it.
Yeah.
And they think they're all against them because they don't understand the strategic voting thing. They feel like it forces their hand.
Yeah,
and then they get defensive about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned a couple things there. First of all, the ultimate betrayal by Justin Trudeau of his election promise to do proportional representation.
One of many.
Two, strategic voting. You're right, because first past the post encourages people to not vote their conscience, which is the exact opposite of what democracy should be. It should be like you're voting your conscience, right? So our current system discourages that. And the final thing, you're right, it discourages people from voting because people feel like their vote doesn't matter. So for all those reasons, folks, learn about proportional representation if you don't already. Bone up on that, because it's really important, and we need to hold our politicians accountable on that issue.
That's right.
But let's move on to the last one here. And Dave, this is one that, again, I think it's going to be. I'm predicting already that this is going to be fairly depressing. I just kind of screwed up my laptop situation here. Let's get our list up again. We're doing this real time, folks, so sometimes these things happen. There we go. Here's one I don't think we're going to hear too much about, but we really should, because obviously we've talked about all pretty much domestic issues up till now, and rightly so, right? It's a Canadian election. We're talking about how we want our country to be. And yet also Canada exists within the world, and Canada is a country that has some power. We sometimes downplay it because we're beside the most powerful country in the world, and that sometimes overshadows us. But, Canada has an important role to play. We are one of the G8 countries. We are a powerful economy. And sadly, we use our influence in the world, generally speaking, in ways that are not good. we support imperialism, whether it's by the United States or NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that we're a member of, along with, France and Great Britain, other powers that like to throw their weight around on the global stage. So, and right now we have in the Trudeau government probably one of the worst examples of this sort of imperialism with a smile that Canada tries to put on. Chrystia Freeland, she's absolutely horrible in terms of her approach to other issues around the world. What have we done recently? I mean, just this really embarrassing attempt to try and overthrow the government of Venezuela. We backed the whole Juan Guaido coup, which was a disaster from the get-go. And we, as part of this Lima group, which is this sort of fake Latin American policy group that our government unfortunately supported, so we're doing things around the world that are not right. We are on the wrong side of the situation in Israel and Palestine, in the sense that we have this uncritical support for the government of Israel for their illegal military occupation of Palestinian land. We are no longer a good faith, neutral broker working for peace in that scenario. Some people would say we never have been. Maybe I'm being a little bit naive, but I think in the past we've certainly had a more independent foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine. So there are really important things that Canada needs to do. Canada could be a good actor on the world stage, could be a force for peace, for justice. And I would like to see Canada become that. But in order for that to happen, there's going to need to be some real changes. I mean, we're going to need to be able to chart an actual independent foreign policy based on international law. And, Dave, maybe that's too much to ask, but it's what needs to happen, man.
Is it? It brought to mind Justin's father, Pierre Trudeau.
Yes.
And talk
Yes.
about another apartheid circumstance, South Africa.
Yes.
Who led the way with that? Many, even Canadians, aren't aware of that. It's a real lack in education. Yeah. Pierre Trudeau, back in the early 70s, began the process of what would you call BDS, of boycotting and divesting and sanctioning of South Africa, saying you got to change this situation, or no, we're not doing business with you. Now, it would be not until pretty much the mid 80s before others caught on to that, because of U.S. pressure, because of the U.S. attachment and close intertwining with the governance in South Africa.
Yes.
So yes, Canada can take an effective lead. How much longer would it have been for those movements to have caught on? Would we today be still looking at it if it were not for him saying, I don't care what your pressures are and everything. This is a moral issue, and we're going to just do it.
That's such an important example historically, Dave, because you're right. Canada has had an independent foreign policy, and Trudeau Senior on Cuba too had an independent policy from the U.S. So that's such a good point, Dave. These things are possible, right? And again, if anything, we want to put out through this podcast is that solutions are possible, right? And that it is possible to create a better world, to build a better society, to resolve some of these challenges and issues that we've been facing. And so I think with this first segment in our election special, we just wanted to get these issues out. We are folks speaking from the political left. We don't speak for the political left, though, so there's lots of disagreements among our folks too. But hopefully you found these issues interesting and thought-provoking, and you may agree, you may disagree. We probably missed stuff too, because again, there's a lot more we could have talked about, trying to keep it to just 10 issues there. But again, folks, thanks very much for stopping by. And in the upcoming election special episodes, we're going to be looking at each political party's platform. The Conservatives, the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens. We're going to break it down. We're going to look at what they are proposing on the issues that are of importance to us. But thanks very much, folks, for stopping by, and we will see you next episode.
Thank you.